A woman tests positive for arsenic poisoning just in time to save her life. But others before her weren't so fortunate. Now investigators must build a case on cremated remains. Doctors watch helplessly as a man wastes away and dies. Detectives diagnose it as murder. And unless they can stop it, it may be going around. A young woman is killed in a tragic riding accident, but a series of subtle clues leads investigators to believe that this tragedy was really no accident. Most victims are poisoned by someone they trust, done in by a fatal lapse of judgment, but it only takes investigators a whisper of suspicion to detect a taste of poison. In March of 1988, in the rural town of San Angelo, Texas, paramedics responded to a call at the home of Lita and Lloyd Nobles.
Hey.
Lita told the paramedics that she and Lloyd had both been suffering from a stomach flu. Lloyd had refused to go to the hospital. 3 days after the onset of his symptoms, Lita found Lloyd unconscious. Paramedics pronounced him dead. Lita Nobles had been nursing her sick husband for months. He'd been in a car accident that should have claimed his life. With a shattered jaw, he could only eat baby food.
About time. What kind of garbage is this?
Lloyd's convalescence was far from peaceful. He and Lita fought like cats and dogs.
All the time.
Well, you just don't know what it's like.
Despite the tension, he seemed to be making a swift recovery. Lita wasn't faring as well. The stress of tending to her quarrelsome husband aggravated her ulcers. She lived on antacids. 2 months after Lloyd's death, a close friend, Tim Scoggin, brought Lita to the hospital. She complained of extreme fatigue, vomiting, and stomach pains. She had lost a large amount of blood. Doctors believed an ulcer was to blame, but treatment didn't improve her condition. Weeks passed. Her condition worsened.
With ulcers in the past. You feel anything there?
Then her hands and feet became paralyzed. Looking for a cause, doctors ran a battery of tests, including a screen for heavy metal poisoning.
I think what we're going to have to wait for is that blood test to come back and...
A urinalysis came back positive. Lita Nobles had arsenic in her body. The Texas Rangers were contacted. Investigator George Frazier's first job was to eliminate environmental contamination as the source of the toxin.
When we first started the investigation, all that we knew was that there was presence of arsenic in the body of Lita Nobles. So in the process of elimination, to find out where she got this poison, we tested her water well. Her house was on a water well.
Arsenic is a poisonous metal found naturally in the earth. Because it is an element, it can't break down. But its atoms can combine to form other compounds. A little arsenic has a lot of killing power. In rural Texas, it was once used as a cotton defoliant. Through runoff, it could contaminate a water supply. Samples from the Nobles' home were taken and tested. The well was clean. Investigators questioned Lita's brother and sister-in-law, who stayed at the house after Lloyd's death. Neither of them suffered any symptoms, even though they had eaten all of their meals there. And yet, during that time, Lita grew progressively sicker, suggesting she'd been repeatedly exposed to the arsenic. As investigators eliminated every possible source of accidental contamination, they came to one grim conclusion. Lita Nobles hadn't been randomly poisoned. She had been targeted for murder. Someone wanted her to die.
Are you using
Investigators questioned her about who might want her dead.
Well, nothing to speak of except what's out in the garage, insecticides and things like that.
She pointed the finger at her deceased husband.
Our first suspect in Lita's poisoning was Algie, because she felt like they were an older couple, and they had a lot of times that they just quarreled and bit at each other, seemed like all the time. And she first told us that if she had been poisoned, he did it. And so we had to eliminate him as a suspect, even though he was already dead.
To find out whether Algie had had a hand in his wife's illness, detectives needed to know whether she'd been poisoned before or after his death. The victim's hair, they believed, would answer that question. Arsenic stays in hair and fingernails long after it has left the bloodstream. By analyzing those traces, forensic scientists would be able to determine how and when Lita had been poisoned. And if they knew that, they'd have a better idea of who tried to kill her. At Texas A&M University, research chemist Dennis James uses a nuclear reactor to determine the precise amount of trace elements in a given sample. The process is called neutron activation analysis.
Neutron activation analysis is capable of testing for a lot of different types of materials. Some of those are poisonous and some of those aren't. It is particularly sensitive to transition metals and some of the heavy metals in particular.
Lita's hair was cut into 6 segments, each representing about a month of hair growth. By comparing the amount of arsenic in each segment, scientists could build a timeline showing when each dose was consumed and how much arsenic it contained. The canister containing the samples is shuttled to the core. There, it is exposed to nuclear energy for 6 hours, during which time some of the elements in the samples absorb subatomic particles and become unstable. Once removed from the reactor, the elements decay, losing the extra subatomic particles. As they do so, they emit a distinct burst of energy called a gamma ray. Using a gamma ray detector, technicians look for arsenic's signature emission. By comparing the readings from the hair snippets to that of the control samples, they can calculate the concentration of arsenic in each sample. Each snip of Lita Nobles' hair, progressing from tips to scalp, showed an increasing amount of arsenic. Lita's dosage had gradually increased over at least 6 months. By administering moderate amounts of arsenic over that length of time, the killer had inadvertently given Lita a tolerance for the poison, which he tried to overcome with a whopping dosage shortly before Lita was hospitalized. The poison had been administered after Algie was buried. He couldn't have been the culprit, but he may have been a victim. Though Algie's hair was too short to tell scientists how long he'd been poisoned, tissue samples taken from his body showed that he, like his wife, endured a massive dose of arsenic. The toxin was found throughout his organs. Finding the poisoner wouldn't be as easy as finding the poison. Someone with access to the elderly couple had, over time, been administering toxic doses of arsenic into their food or drink. That meant that the murderer was probably someone close to the Nobles. Someone they trusted. Investigators faced the delicate task of asking the victim's friends to point out who among them might be a poisoner. a neighbor had a suggestion.
And this next door neighbor felt that a young man named Timothy Scoggin was a very likely suspect because he spent a lot of time in their home.
New in town, Scoggin was a well-liked member of the San Angelo community. Best known for his skill as a porcelain painter and his willingness to help the town's senior citizens with errands and odd jobs.
That's very nice. Short stroke.
He was a mortician by trade, but appeared to be doing well in a series of business ventures.
It looks beautiful.
And he loved to make himself useful. Among the elderly people he helped were Lita and Algie Nobles. Shortly after befriending them, he had purchased their air conditioning business.
Okay.
Although he was chronically behind in his mortgage payments, Lita's faith in this surrogate son never wavered. After Algie's death, Lita had relied heavily on him. To Frazier, Scoggin fit the profile of a poisoner. First of all, he had motive. He owed the victims $100,000. Secondly, he had access to the Nobles' home. Finally, he had his victims' undying trust.
After we suspected Timothy Scoggin, we went and talked to Mrs. Nobles and interviewed her in the hospital room. She practically ran us out. She liked this guy. He was coming to the hospital room and doing her hair and doing her nails.
But it wouldn't be long before Frazier could expose the greed beneath Scoggin's angelic demeanor. He learned that during the time of Lita's hospitalization, there had been a lot of suspicious activity in her bank account. While she lay in bed, nearly $48,000 in personal checks had been written to Tim Scoggin. Suspicious for a woman who had no use of her hands.
She has these rubber bands and braces on her hands and couldn't sign her name if she wanted to. So we passed those checks in front of her and asked her how she signed those. And that was enough to convince her that he was the one.
But check forging doesn't prove homicide.
Yeah, but a report, yep,
If detectives were going to turn their suspicion into a murder charge, they'd need to know more about what made Tim Scoggin tick.
Heard anything yet?
A probe into his past convinced investigators that his penchant for poisoning didn't start with Lita and Algie Nobles.
And it's very nice, sure.
Investigators learned that before moving to San Angelo, Tim Scoggin had lived with two elderly sisters who had died suddenly within days of each other. Scoggin boasted he'd probably be inheriting a small fortune from these deceased aunts.
Well, thank you very much.
But the true story was far different than the version Scoggin had been spreading around town.
They were not aunts. They weren't any kin to Timothy Scoggin. However, interestingly enough, he had been kind of a houseboy, an errand boy for them, and had lived with them off and on for a long time.
As he had done with the Nobles, Scoggin endeared himself to Catherine and Cordelia Norton.
Thought this might pick up your spirits a little bit.
Just 5 weeks before Algie Nobles succumbed, both sisters were dead. In February, Scoggin had taken Catherine Norton, a diabetic, to the hospital for a checkup after her surgery for cancer of the pancreas.
Cordelia,
When they returned home, Cordelia became violently ill. He quickly shuttled the older sister to the hospital.
Oh, my.
Scoggin and Catherine returned home and went to sleep.
Thanks so much, and you have a good night.
Scoggin stayed at the house in case Catherine needed anything. In the morning, Scoggin checked on Catherine and, finding her unresponsive, called her doctor. He pronounced Catherine dead. The next day, Cordelia died in her hospital bed. Both deaths were ruled natural causes.
No, I think probably he's already...
6 months after the deaths of the Norton sisters, investigators wanted to know if they, like the Nobles, had been poisoned by arsenic. Problem was, Catherine and Cordelia Norton had been cremated. Investigators learned that Tim Scoggin had used his expertise as a mortician to destroy any evidence of foul play in the deaths of the Norton sisters.
He used that knowledge to know how to forge orders for cremation, which he presented on both of these ladies and said that they had personally requested from him that they be cremated as soon as they had died. And they were promptly cremated and buried.
Investigators now were faced with the task of detecting poison in ashes. No one had ever tried this before. If scientists could navigate this uncharted territory, they'd be one step closer to catching a murderer. The ashes of Cordelia and Catherine Norton were brought to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory, where toxicologist Rod McCutcheon was asked to analyze them chemically. He was initially doubtful about his chance of success.
I really didn't think there would be much of a chance to find any poison in cremation remains. I'd never heard of anyone trying to do this. After reflecting a minute about the particular poison he was interested in, the arsenic, I realized that there was some possibility that the arsenic may still be present because it's an element, and an element will not change.
To test for the presence of arsenic, McCutcheon placed the cremated remains in an acidic solution, then heated it. Impurities are burned away. If there is any arsenic, it remains in the liquid. Chemicals are added to turn the arsenic into a gas. It bubbles through a liquid which turns purple in the presence of arsenic. The more arsenic in the sample, the more intense the color. The tests showed that Cordelia's remains contained lethal amounts of arsenic. Catherine's remains showed none. The negative findings in Catherine's ashes actually bolstered the case by serving as a control. Since both sisters had died on the same day and had been cremated in the same oven, the lack of arsenic in one of the samples proved that the ashes were not contaminated by the burning process. Neutron activation analysis confirmed the findings. Detectives began their pursuit of Scoggin by seeing if he had purchased arsenic. They visited the local grocery store.
There's nobody in there, Farm. Can I help you? Yes.
Here, Tim Scoggin's love of familiarity would strike against him. The clerk told detectives that he remembered Scoggin buying a large amount of rat poison shortly before any of the victims died. The primary ingredient of rat poison is arsenic. Investigators deduced that Scoggin had mixed the poison with products that he knew only his victims would eat: Algie's baby food and Lita's antacid. Since he regularly delivered their groceries, he could have mixed up the rat poison before bringing them over. To test their hunch, investigators searched the Nobles' cabinets and refrigerator. Most of the food had been thrown away, but a few of Lita's antacids were still around. A single bottle of the medicine tested positive for arsenic. Based on the scientific evidence, law enforcement was ready to take Tim Scoggin into custody.
The real strong thing that made the case for us was the work done in the laboratories. Of course, there's no other way we'd have ever found arsenic in those ashes, nor in the body of Mr. Nobles. And so the people who did the forensic work really are the ones who turned the crank in this case for us. We'd probably still be working on it if it hadn't been for them finding this heavy metal poison.
Scoggin was arrested for the murder of Algie Nobles and the attempted murder of Lita. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And even though there was no direct proof that he killed Catherine Norton, investigators believe he tampered with her insulin dosage. He subsequently pleaded guilty to the murders of both sisters and was given 2 50-year sentences. The horrifying truth is that poisoners often get away with their crimes, at least for a while. But vigilance and persistence are strong antidotes to a poisoner's toxic schemes. On November 1st, 1982, paramedics in St. Peters, Missouri were summoned to the home of Lloyd and Shirley Allen. 40-year-old Lloyd Allen had been sick for months with an undiagnosed illness. That morning, his wife said, he became violently ill, then lost consciousness. The coroner believed that he died from natural causes, but he couldn't be sure. On the death certificate, cause of death remained blank. A few days later, Detective Robert Birding of the St. Charles County Sheriff's Department learned of a series of anonymous calls phoned into the local news station. Lloyd Allen hadn't died a natural death, the tipsters said. He'd been poisoned.
A canvass of Lloyd Allen's neighbors was initiated, and it was subsequently learned that the anonymous phone calls came from one or more of Lloyd's neighbors.
Detective Birding did a routine follow-up to see if the phone calls had any merit. Meantime, authorities prevented the body from being buried, pending investigation.
Hi, ma'am. I'm Sergeant Birding of the St. Charles County Sheriff's.
The neighbors told police that the timing of his illness was suspicious. Lloyd's health and behavior changed drastically after his new wife and her daughters moved in. To investigators, these neighborly observations didn't seem like much at first, hardly the kind of information to hang a murder investigation on. But they prompted police to ask more questions about the Allen family. Friends and neighbors told police that problems began shortly after Shirley and Lloyd married in the fall of 1981. Everyone was pleased that Lloyd, a sociable and generous man, had finally found the love and companionship he'd been looking his whole life for. It was his first marriage, but Shirley's fourth. After the wedding, Lloyd brought Shirley Allen and her 2 daughters, 15-year-old Norma and 12-year-old Paula, into his home. Now he had an instant family to banish the loneliness and a true soulmate in his new wife.
Norma? Norma? Norma?
But winter brought stress and unhappiness to the family.
Go on back to your room.
Norma ran away from home several times and eventually landed in juvenile detention. The marriage grew strained. Then Lloyd started feeling sick. Lloyd went from doctor to doctor. None was able to relieve his symptoms or tell him what was wrong. He tried to work around the house and yard, but was too weak to complete any of his projects. Detectives learned that Shirley tried to boost his stamina with an iron supplement drink, but it didn't help. As he grew sicker, she began keeping him away from other people. Suspicions began to center around Lloyd's new wife.
Drink some more.
The neighbors related to us that she was segregating him from neighbors. He wouldn't be seen out very much. He wouldn't be able to acknowledge their hellos and their gestures of greeting because of his poor health. And it appeared to them that Shirley was concealing Lloyd.
Then, finally, she cut him off entirely. A neighbor had come to pick up a wheelbarrow he'd loaned to Lloyd. Concerned about his friend's diminished health, he urged Lloyd to seek another doctor. The conversation was cut short when Shirley arrived. She ushered the neighbor out and later filed a trespassing complaint against him. Shirley's behavior seemed odd, but investigators couldn't hang a murder case on neighborhood gossip. Birding needed to discover a motive. He did.
Shirley was the beneficiary of a $25,000 life policy, and we also learned that she was the beneficiary of Lloyd's will, which had recently been changed.
It is only natural for a wife to be named as her husband's beneficiary. But it was the timing, not the payoff, that gave detectives pause. Lloyd's health began to decline just days after signing the papers. That was something to go on, but not much. It didn't provide the kind of firm foundation detectives required to move forward. Birding hoped that an interview with the suspect would reveal something more, but he was met only with stock answers.
Of course, she gave us some exculpatory statements that Lloyd Allen's death was of natural causes. He's being treated by a variety of physicians for a variety of illnesses that she described to us as depression. There was a litany of medications in the home that she said that he was taking for his treatment.
The fact remained that the victim had continued wasting away with no apparent cause and no evidence of disease. Mrs. Allen was still a suspect. She had motive and opportunity. But investigators had no clues, no witnesses, and no idea what killed Lloyd Allen. Lloyd Allen was dead, and detectives suspected he was poisoned by his wife. But they had no way of proving it. The investigation stalled.
This is in regard to the death of Lloyd Allen.
Then police got a break when a witness came forward.
I don't want to talk over the phone. Is it possible?
4 days after Lloyd's death, Shirley's daughter Norma called the sheriff's department. She told them she was in possession of the poison. Norma backed up her story with some evidence. Inside a brown paper bag, detectives found a wine bottle filled with green liquid. On the label, a handwritten warning read, "Don't drink." A warning that Norma told police her mother asked her to write. Norma said she wasn't sure what was in the bottle, but she suspected it was antifreeze. She told investigators that over the last 2 months, she'd seen her mother giving the liquid to Lloyd. Norma also told police that she'd witnessed her mother mixing gas treatment with sugar and orange food coloring to simulate the iron supplement. On the day of his death, Norma said, Shirley poured him a dose of pure antifreeze and forced him to drink it.
Maybe we should call a doctor.
Guided by Norma's testimony, toxicologists tested the contents of the bottle for antifreeze. A sample of the liquid was injected into the gas chromatograph. The apparatus separates a compound into smaller chemicals so it can be analyzed. Each chemical is displayed as a peak on a graph. The resulting peak was a match for antifreeze, known chemically as ethylene glycol. According to toxicologist Christopher Long of St. Louis University, antifreeze with its sweet taste is a subtle, stealthy killer. The victim might never even realize he's drinking himself to death.
Antifreeze would produce something like having a drink of alcohol. But as far as a burning sensation or anything to warn you, no, it wouldn't. So it'd be the same as maybe if you had a little taste of beer or something like that, only without the flavoring. So you might get just a slight change in how you feel, but nothing really noticeable.
But over time, antifreeze is deadly. As it is metabolized by the body, it produces toxins that raise the acid level of the blood. With each dose, Lloyd Allen's body and mind would slowly be destroyed.
When your body chemistries change and your kidneys aren't working, it's not purifying your blood of the waste products. So that could, in fact, account for why he appeared dizzy or a zombie-like or just plain dull. You know, his mind wasn't working properly.
We can't seem to find
Because so many of Lloyd's organs were failing, it would have been difficult for any doctor to diagnose the poisoning. In the final stages, even if Lloyd knew that the woman he loved betrayed him with poison, he would have been too weak to protect himself and too confused to plea for help. Scientists determined that antifreeze poisoning was consistent with Lloyd Allen's mysterious ailment. To prove it, the body was autopsied and tissue samples were tested. His liver, kidneys, and brain contained crystals formed by the breakdown of massive quantities of ethylene glycol. It was consistent with long-term consumption of the liquid. The coroner ruled Lloyd's death a homicide by ethylene glycol poisoning. Detectives had found their poison. Now they had to be sure about the poisoner.
Well,
Norma was a troubled teenager who'd been at odds with her mother for years. The possibility remained that she had poisoned Lloyd herself to frame her mother. After a series of interviews, that theory was quickly discounted. Norma was truly fond of the victim and had nothing to gain by his death. With the evidence in hand, police arrested Shirley Allen. They were able easily to construct their case against her. A $25,000 life insurance policy gave her the motive to kill her husband. The spiked wine bottle gave her the means. In a trial that lasted only 4 days, she was found guilty of killing Lloyd Allen. Shirley Allen was sentenced to life with no parole for 50 years. She died in prison.
Without the forensics evidence and learning that actually Lloyd Allen's body contained ethyl glycol, we would not have had a homicide investigation. We would not have learned of his death as being a homicide, and Shirley Allen most likely would have gotten away with his death.
Because of the concern of Lloyd Allen's neighbors, a cunning murderer was brought to justice. It wasn't the only time a crime was exposed when nosy neighbors smelled trouble. It was a summer evening in 1980 when David Davis sped to his neighbor's house in Hillsdale, Michigan, pleading for assistance. Davis told his neighbor that he and Shannon, his wife of 10 months, had been riding when her horse reared, sending her tumbling. She had struck her head on a large rock. Injured, but still conscious, she sent him for help. The men arrived to find Shannon Davis unresponsive. Her head was bleeding. Her skin had a bluish cast. They rushed her to the hospital. When she arrived, she had no pulse and her pupils were fixed and dilated. Technicians attempted to resuscitate her, but failed. Doctors determined that she had died of a head injury from the fall. Case closed. But not for long. 2 months later, the incident came to the attention of Michigan State Police Detective Don Brooks. Brooks had heard that Davis's neighbor had refused to let the case die.
The death was ruled to be an accident, but the circumstances are such that he felt this was probably a murder case.
Suspicion took root in the neighbor's mind the day after the death when he revisited the scene. He noticed that the branches of a nearby tree were marred by 2 circular bruises, suggesting that horses had been tied there. A fresh pile of manure sat 6 feet away, confirming that impression. It appeared that the Davises, the only riders in the area, had stopped here long enough to tie their horses. That didn't fit with Davis's story about the victim's horse bolting and his mad rush to find help. The neighbor, Dick Britton, was also a family friend. But he grew concerned that Davis was hiding something.
First, I felt guilty thinking that way. I kept thinking, well, I got to be wrong. But this went on for quite a while, and you just keep thinking, and things just didn't add up, didn't make sense.
Shannon and David had been married for only 10 months before the accident, wed after only a 7-week courtship. It was love at first sight. After their marriage, Shannon came to live on Davis's farm. He taught her how to ride. To Britton and the victim's family, the account Davis had given didn't fit with the way he'd seen Shannon riding just minutes before the accident. She was a cautious rider with a quiet horse. Shannon's parents really didn't know much about their son-in-law, except that he made their daughter happier than they'd ever seen her. After the accident, the victim's parents had clashed with Davis. He wanted to have his wife cremated.
Cremated? No way. Hey, listen.
They insisted on burial, and so Shannon was buried.
And there's a double indemnity.
At the hospital, Davis told Shannon's family that he had no life insurance for her.
The other will benefit by receiving the other.
Honey, don't you think that's a little too much?
But they learned that weeks before her death, the newlyweds had signed a policy.
I have a contract for each of you to
Now, Davis was preparing to collect on it. With double indemnity for accidental death, Davis stood to gain more than $300,000. The family believed that provided 300,000 reasons for Davis to plan a murder. To investigators, it merely looked like a grieving family trying to blame a tragic accident on the victim's new husband. The meddling neighbor was helping to stir them up. Fueled by their suspicions, Shannon's family and Britton urged authorities to reopen the case. 1 month after her death, the victim's body was exhumed. The examination clearly showed a fatal brain injury and bruises consistent with a fall from a horse. A routine drug screen was also conducted, but the physical damage was so compelling that the case was closed a second time, even before the drug screen was completed. Britton and the family would not let the matter rest.
Mr. Britton? Don Brooks in the state police. Oh, glad you come.
The Detroit Free Press published an article on their suspicions surrounding their daughter's death. It prompted the state attorney's office to get involved. Don Brooks handled the case.
I thought to myself, if 50% of this article is accurate, there's a great deal of information to go on, and it's going to be very helpful, and it sure leads one to believe that this is a murder case, not an accident.
For Brooks, the capstone of Britton's argument involved the rock which ended the victim's life. It was the only one in the area. It might have been a freak coincidence that she happened to hit her head on it. But in light of the other evidence, this small detail raised big questions.
The percentage of someone falling off from a horse in that area and happen to hit their head on the only rock around was so high that that itself should raise a lot of questions.
Well, that tree right there, they
The closer Brooks looked into the death, the more suspicious he became.
Okay, now is this a
He sought the results of the drug screen from the autopsy and learned that it too raised some difficult questions.
Pile of horse dung, then over here.
It was time to seek answers. In the lab, a tissue sample from the autopsy was analyzed by a gas chromatograph. Every substance creates its own peak of a specific length at a specific point. These peaks are called the retention time of the substance. The chromatograph showed a strange chemical in the victim's tissue that matched nothing in the lab's database. No one knew what it was, but before they could pursue it, the case was closed again, and the mystery was buried with the victim. Still convinced that Shannon was murdered, her family pinned their hopes on this mysterious peak, pressuring investigators to study it further. Technicians toiled for weeks, but couldn't identify the compound. They ruled out instrument error. They simulated the conditions of embalming and burial on sample tissues to see if the victim's tissue was contaminated after death. No matter what they did, they couldn't isolate the chemical. All they knew was that there was something in the victim's body that shouldn't have been there. And they had no idea what it was. 4 months after the tragic horseback riding fall that ended Shannon Davis's life, grave suspicions swirled around the so-called accident. Based on the questionable crime scene, the insurance money, and the curious lab results, Brooks was convinced that foul play was involved in the victim's death. Now he had to prove it.
You put it all together, and it was very obvious to me that this was a murder case.
He set his crosshairs on the victim's husband, David Davis. But Davis had moved to Florida. Investigators had no choice but to watch him go. Though the circumstantial evidence was heaped against him, there was no solid proof that he lied about the accident.
Even if I received a confession from Dave Davis, we still had the problem with the autopsy saying that those injuries were consistent with falling off from a horse, striking the head, and the cause of death was the injury to the brain. So that became the challenge of the medical community at that point.
The case teetered on the mysterious chemical peak. Uncovering its relationship, if any, to the victim's death was the last chance detectives had to foil what might otherwise prove to be the perfect crime. Unable to determine what the compound was, Brooks reviewed the other facts of the crime. What he couldn't figure out was how the victim could have been unlucky enough to have struck that solitary rock. Brooks mulled various scenarios over with his colleagues, but none seemed to work. Then, a moment of inspiration struck, revealing a scheme that would tie up all the loose ends and explain the mystery chemical.
If this young lady was paralyzed in some way, you know, her muscular system, her nervous system was paralyzed in such a way where she couldn't resist and he could create the injury he wanted.
Investigators believed that the victim was immobilized before her head was intentionally struck against the rock. They began searching for a chemical that would fit a killer's criteria. A drug that could immobilize quickly, then leave little trace. It would also have to be easy to obtain without rousing suspicion. What could it be, and where would they find it? Since Davis lived on a farm, it was likely that he had access to compounds designed for animals. Detectives interviewed one of the vets employed by Davis. He described a litany of sedatives and tranquilizers. Among them was a drug that seemed a likely candidate. Succinylcholine is a powerful muscle relaxant. In humans, it can paralyze the respiratory system in seconds. Because it breaks down into chemicals naturally found in the body, SCH is considered a nearly perfect murder weapon, one that wouldn't show up in a gas chromatograph. At Brooks's request, toxicologist Tom Carroll of the Medical College of Ohio tested it anyway.
So I immediately went over to our pharmacy, got some succinylcholine, and was able to put it onto the gas chromatograph, and it had the exact same retention time as our unknown peak. Bingo. We thought we had something.
To confirm the results, the chromatograph was recalibrated and the SCH retested a total of 5 times. Each time, the results were identical. But for absolute confirmation, the tissue samples had to be tested on the more sensitive mass spectrometer to see if the chemical could be isolated that way. The samples were sent to 2 labs for fine-tuned analysis. Unfortunately, neither of the mass spectrometers could distinguish the chemical in the victim's tissues. Carroll took the SCH and the tissue samples to Stockholm, Sweden, where scientists were experimenting with methods to analyze chemicals very similar to SCH. Shannon's tissues were tested in the spectrometer there. The initial results were disappointing. Test after test failed to reveal the chemical. If they couldn't find it, then Davis would have committed the perfect crime. Carroll wouldn't allow that to happen. Investigators pressed on. The precision that made the spectrometer so sensitive also made it temperamental. After scores of attempts, a tiny adjustment to the temperature of the equipment brought hard-won success.
Boom. We had found it. And I mean, you talk about a celebration. This was some hooping and hollering that you never believed. From there on out, it was simply a matter of doing more extractions, getting all the data necessary. We were now able to identify it in the tissues.
Now, investigators had to determine how the chemical was introduced into the victim's body. More than a year after her death, the victim was re-exhumed and a new autopsy performed to look for a likely site of injection. It revealed extensive bruising on the left. These injuries told of a hard fall. The right side was uninjured, except for 2 curious marks, one on her shoulder, one on her wrist. These 2 bruises represented the faint tracks of a killer's needle. They had been overlooked before because no one suspected that a needle was used in the crime. As investigators prepared their findings, they thought their long struggle was over. Scientists in Sweden thought they'd found the weapon that killed Shannon Davis in Michigan. Through sheer diligence, they perfected a way to isolate traces of deadly SCH from human tissue. The jubilant team told investigators that they could now arrest the suspect, David Davis.
We told Don Brooks, and we told him back there, we got it. Get him. Can't do that. The method has not been scientifically evaluated yet.
The success of their test relied on an experimental method for preparing the tissue sample. Before a new forensic technique can be accepted in the courtroom, other scientists must evaluate it. The process can take years. But because of the gravity of the case, Carroll's findings were reviewed and published in a matter of weeks. Scientists had successfully proven that SCH had a role in the death of Shannon Davis. Brooks's theory had proved correct. According to the prosecution scenario, Davis set out to kill his wife on their way home from the Britons. He tied the horses, then went after Shannon with a syringe, injecting her twice with the lethal drug.
For that second injection site to be delivered, she would probably have had to have been paralyzed at that point because it was precisely right on the vein. This bruise up here was probably as a result of the struggle while he's injecting her, while she still had some life in her. And that's how I think it. You know, once she goes to the ground and collapses, then he can pick her up and drop her onto this rock, and that will create the effect of falling from the horse.
It was a cleverly thought out plan, undone by the scientific method. Davis staged what he thought was the perfect crime. The only problem was the perfect murder weapon was no longer so perfect. David Davis was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Brooks suspected that Shannon Davis wasn't the first person whose death by SCH poisoning was overlooked. But because of this case, hopefully, she's one of the last.
And so to be a part of an investigation like this, where the medical field basically, or the information about succinylcholine in the medical field has been rewritten, that's kind of a nice thing to be a part of.
It's impossible to know how many more victims have been killed silently by people they trusted. Poisoners may never lay a hand on their victims, but with advancing forensics techniques, it's getting harder to escape without leaving a print. In Hollywood, a dead man isn't who he appears to be, and someone just walked away with $1 million insurance benefit. Now, forensics must prove that murder was part of the package. A police officer kills his wife in a freak car accident, but investigators believe he may have been driven to homicide. A simple farmer stands accused of murdering his brother, and a town rallies to his defense. So does forensic science. They look death in the face every day of their lives. From fragments of bone, drops of blood, and slivers of tissue, they can piece together the shattered circumstances that bring the deceased to their labs. Every body has a story to tell, and each is a page in the coroner's casebook. When someone dies, their work begins. Coroners, medical examiners, and criminalists know that every kind of death leaves its subtle mark. And they know murder when they see it. Early in the morning of April 16, 1988, the Glendale, California 911 dispatcher received a call about a man in cardiac arrest. The call was placed by Dr. Richard Boggs, a respected neurologist. When paramedics arrived at his office, he explained that the man was one of his patients named Gene Hansen, who had a history of heart trouble. The victim had credit cards in Hansen's name. Before he called 911, Dr. Boggs said he'd done all he could to revive his patient, but nothing worked. Gene Hansen was declared dead at the scene. At the LA County Coroner's Office, the body was given a routine autopsy. The office sees 200 bodies each day, and this one was just another face in the crowd. Seeing no immediate cause of death except for a few marks on the heart, the coroner deferred to the diagnosis of the victim's personal physician, Dr. Boggs. Hansen's cause of death was listed as heart failure due to a dangerous heart condition. The body was released to the hands of John Hawkins, Hanson's companion and his partner in their successful sportswear business. He flew to California from Ohio to claim the remains. He had them cremated in respect for Hanson's last request. Hawkins, as his partner's sole beneficiary, then received the first million of Hanson's $1.5 million life insurance policy. Usually, that would be the end of the story. But this story was just getting started. 5 months after the death, an insurance agent was closing Hanson's file when she noticed something strange. The face on Hanson's autopsy photo didn't resemble the photo supplied by the Department of Motor Vehicles. To double check, she requested that the thumbprint on file at the DMV be compared with the one from the autopsy. No doubt about it. These were two different men. And that raised two vital questions. Where was the real Hanson, and who was the dead man? The agent had uncovered something a lot more serious than insurance fraud. Though they're situated next to each other, the difference between Glendale, California and North Hollywood is like night and day. But this is where Glendale police went to solve the mystery of the dead man who wasn't Gene Hanson. Police determined from fingerprints and missing persons reports that the man was really a bookkeeper named Ellis Green. He was last seen leaving a bar in North Hollywood on April 15th. The next day, he was declared dead under an assumed name in Dr. Boggs's office. Sergeant John Perkins of the Glendale Police tried to sort out what happened.
A photograph of Ellis Green's body that was depicted in the doctor's office was taken to his elderly aunt, and that photo was shown to her. She identified that as being Ellis Green, her nephew. Now we knew we had the real body, the real name, but we still didn't have an exact or approximate cause of death.
Demonstrating how Green died was only half the task before him. Investigators also had to prove that the real Gene Hanson was still alive. By now, months had passed. If Hanson were alive, he had an enormous head start to find a hiding place. John Hawkins, his partner in this elaborate insurance scam, had also vanished, along with $1 million of insurance money.
Michael Button, John Perkins.
Police concentrated on the last person to see the victim alive, Dr. Boggs.
Hello, officers. I'm Dr. Boggs. What can I do for you?
Police paid a visit to him to find out about the man who died in his office. Boggs told them that he'd been a patient for years. Boggs knew him only as Melvin Eugene Hanson, or Gene. He had no reason to suspect it was an assumed name. Faced with a search warrant, he handed over his patient's files. Sergeant Perkins examined them. It was possible that Dr. Boggs was telling the truth. Gene Hanson's records showed that he'd been repeatedly warned about his condition, but refused to follow doctor's orders. But it was also possible that Dr. Boggs was in on this elaborate insurance scam, and the records themselves were doctored. Perkins pulled 3 EKG strips, dated several months apart. He wondered if they truly demonstrated the life-threatening heart condition that supposedly killed Green. He asked a cardiologist to analyze the EKGs. The heart specialist told him that they indicated a mild, common condition that wasn't fatal. Perkins was more suspicious than ever that Dr. Boggs had intentionally faked the records. But he couldn't prove it. Then he found the answer was right on the EKG strips, simple enough for even a layman to understand.
Late one night, I was sitting at my desk and I'm looking at these EKG strips and I'm going through them and I'm looking at them and suddenly it became very obvious. One was completely clean. One had a red dye halfway down the length of the EKG strip, and the other one had a complete dye from the entire length of the EKG strip. And you suddenly think, wait a minute, these are all connected. So I put them up on the desk and put them end to end, and sure enough, the fractures matched perfectly.
The red markings signaling the end of the roll formed one continuous darkening line across two of the three strips, allowing Perkins to put them into sequential order. But when he did so, the dates that Boggs wrote on the back of the strips were out of order and months apart.
These were fabricated EKG strips.
While Perkins was making his discovery, the case was progressing on a different front.
You want to check this area in here, and I'll go in the kitchen and check. Okay.
Police were following the trail of Ellis Green's credit card purchases. The dead man's cards were still active and still in use. Investigators weren't sure who was using them, but they hoped it was the real Gene Hansen. They tracked the card to a bungalow on Key West, Florida. The rental agent confirmed that the tenant was a man named Ellis Green. He had moved out weeks earlier, and the apartment hadn't been rented since. Detectives looked for any clues that could reveal the identity of the former occupant. On a glass in a cabinet, they found one, a fingerprint. It matched Gene Hansen's. Now they had proof that he was alive.
Sir, could you ever see
Then, in January 1989, 9 months after his reported death, Gene Hansen, traveling under another assumed name, was stopped at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport returning from Mexico. He'd been acting eccentrically enough for customs agents to pull him over and inspect his suitcases. They found $14,000 in cash that he failed to declare, thereby breaking the law. They also found the IDs for 13 people. Among them was Ellis Green's, the dead man in Dr. Boggs's office. Here was proof that he'd switched identities with the victim and pocketed some of his own death benefits. He was arrested. With Gene Hansen captured and the incriminating EKG strips, police had enough to arrest Boggs as well. They knew they had him for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. In fact, they uncovered evidence that he and Hansen had pulled off some fraudulent claims in the past. The two of them, along with John Hawkins, staged car accidents for the insurance money. Dr. Boggs was the physician who signed off on their medical claims. But was there enough evidence to prove that Boggs actually murdered Ellis Green as part of the conspiracy? Without a body, they didn't seem to have much of a case. Boggs claimed that they originally hoped to steal a body from the morgue, but that proved impossible. Then, by gruesome coincidence, the conspirators said they happened upon Ellis Green's body shortly after he died. Despite how unlikely the story sounded, Boggs challenged the prosecution to prove he was lying. Glendale Police Sergeant John Perkins had to somehow turn an elaborate insurance scam into a case of homicide. Gene Hansen, the man who faked his own death, and Richard Boggs, the accommodating physician, were already in custody. Perkins was eager to put all the pieces together and wrap it up, But there was still no sign of John Hawkins, the beneficiary who fled with the $1 million insurance payout. And still, investigators were short on evidence to prove what they strongly suspected, that Dr. Boggs murdered Ellis Green to pass him off as Gene Hansen.
We really needed somebody who could look at the entire pieces of evidence that we had, that being the autopsy report, some of the tissues. There was a stomach content that was collected at the time of autopsy, and examine those from an independent view, to look at the crime scene photos, to give us some indication as to this person did not die of natural causes. And that's when we brought in Dr. Michael Bodden.
Michael Bodden is the executive director of the New York State Police Forensic Science Unit. He's also an expert on the nuances that death leaves on the body. He has worked on the congressional committees that investigated the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. In the case of Ellis Green, Bodden had slides of his heart, lung, and liver tissue, as well as photographs of the victim that were taken shortly after death. From this evidence, Bodden could determine two facts with confidence. One, Green did not have a fatal heart condition, and two, his skin, which showed no other marks, was blue at the time of death, suggesting lack of oxygen. From these two facts, Bodden reached a single conclusion. Green was suffocated. Except for the telltale blue color, in the absence of a struggle, suffocation leaves no marks. Its diagnosis comes from eliminating all other possible causes of death. It's a diagnosis of exclusion.
A bullet wound, we don't need a diagnosis of exclusion because we find a hole in the body. A stab wound or a blow from a baseball bat all leave marks on the body that we can see at autopsy. But if something is put over the nose and mouth, causing a person to die because he or she can't breathe, and then that object is removed, a hand or a pillow, at the autopsy there's no specific finding that's going to say that he was suffocated.
The evidence was enough to convince a jury that the three men had planned the crime together, and that Dr. Boggs, the healer, was Dr. Boggs, a killer.
These three individuals were not strangers to crime. They had hooked up probably 4 years before this particular murder, and they had worked out different ways of committing insurance fraud. And the plan that they evolved was somebody had to die. That person, they agreed, was to be Gene Hansen. And the only way that they could pull this thing off was with a doctor, and that doctor was Dr. Boggs.
Police believe that Boggs picked Ellis Green up at a bar, the last place he had been seen. He bought him some drinks to make him more compliant. The victim's blood alcohol content was well above the legal limit. Then, Boggs lured him to his office. Just in case the victim was still sober enough to fight back, Boggs may have incapacitated him with a stun gun. Then the victim was smothered without putting up a fight. Perkins believes that the forensic pathologist's determination of murder made this case winnable.
Dr. Bodden's testimony in this particular case, I feel, was that last inning, you're down by 2 and bases are loaded, and Dr. Bodden came in and basically hit a home run for us.
In 1990, Richard Boggs was found guilty of first-degree murder and fraud. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. It took 3 years and a worldwide manhunt before police caught up with John Hawkins on the island of Sardinia. In 1995, both he and Melvin Eugene Hansen were convicted of fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Hansen was given life without parole. Hawkins received 25 years to life. The work of the medical examiner undermined the murderous conspiracy of Gene Hansen and his cohorts. But whether a crime is ingenious or devilishly simple, the forensics required to solve it is equally complex. On the rainy night of November 27, 1992, just after 9:30 p.m., a passing motorist reported what looked like an accident on Hawaii's Volcano Highway. Police arrived to find a van facing the wrong way, apparently after spinning. The responding officer recognized the owner of the van to be Ken Matheson, a sergeant on the police force. Ken was badly shaken up. His wife, Ivonne, fared much worse. Ken had tended to her in the back of the van until help arrived. She had lost a lot of blood. By strange coincidence, Ivonne Matheson was a nurse who helped deliver the responding officer's first child weeks before. Paramedics moved her into the ambulance to rush her to the hospital at Hilo. The hospital where she worked became the place where she died. When Ken Matheson's fellow officers heard about the incident on the police radio, they went to see him at the hospital. Matheson told one of his colleagues that his wife's death was a terrible accident. She was driving the van when they started to fight. Things escalated. Enraged beyond reason, Ivonne jumped out of the open window of the moving van. Ken said he slid over to steer the vehicle, then backed up to look for his wife. That's when he ran over her. Ivonne and Ken Matheson had once been divorced, but then decided to give their marriage a second chance. It seemed to be working this time, give or take the usual rough spots. Then, this tragedy destroyed it all. According to Hilo police, any accident that results in death is considered negligent homicide. For this misdemeanor, Matheson could expect a maximum fine of $1,000 and a year in jail. At the least, he'd be fined $100 or be sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
Don't worry.
In any case, he'd be able to keep his badge. He didn't protest the charges. As in any sudden death, a complete investigation would have to be conducted. It was a formality. The death of Ivonne Matheson was unfortunate and tragic, but police had no reason to doubt Ken's story. While the investigation was underway, Matheson stayed on active duty with the police force. But after inspecting the scene of the accident, Hawaii County Police noticed some minor inconsistencies between the roadside evidence and Matheson's story. At first, they seemed hardly worth mentioning. Each year, tourists flock to Hawaii to escape the cares of their daily lives. The sun, the surf, and the primal fiery beauty of the volcanoes exert their cleansing influence. For Hawaii's inhabitants, life in paradise goes on just like anywhere else. Crimes are committed, accidents happen, and investigators are charged with determining which is which. In Hilo, traffic investigators inspected the area where the wife of Sergeant Ken Matheson lost her life. They found relatively little blood on the highway compared to what was found in the van. Though it was a little peculiar, they wrote it off to the rain and the fact that Ken Matheson had rushed his dying wife into the van after he struck her. At the police impoundment lot, the van had its own story to tell. It was routine procedure for a vehicle involved in a fatal accident to undergo a mechanical inspection. It negates any future defense claims of faulty equipment. Police also had to be sure the van was safe to drive before they could release it to Matheson. Because of the nature of this accident, the undercarriage was thoroughly inspected. Hawaii County Police traffic investigator Martin Elazar was surprised by the relative lack of damage he found there. However, when he was done inspecting the outside, the interior of the van caught his interest.
I peered inside from the outside and I could see blood stains. Blood stains on the driver's side window, blood stains on the plastic cover to the panel area fronting the steering wheel. Blood stains up above there. There's a heavy concentration of blood and hair on that bolt.
There was no reason for blood to be in the driver's portion of the vehicle. Elazar needed a closer look, but to search inside the van required a warrant. He asked Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn to request one. The warrant came through in the nick of time. 3 months had passed since the incident. According to Spohn, their main piece of evidence almost slipped through their fingers.
You do a mechanical inspection, and once all the mechanical inspections and the search warrants are finished, you return the van to the owner. And in this case, the van was authorized to be returned to the owner.
Fortunately, Matheson hadn't picked it up yet. The van was secure. The release authorization was canceled. A search warrant for the van's interior was issued. Now, Spohn had to face the dismal possibility that Sergeant Matheson's story might be a lie. And though they still had the van, another piece of vital evidence was lost forever.
We decided that this case was possibly more than a negligent homicide. And because of that, we decided we should probably have a forensic pathologist do an autopsy in this case. However, at that time, we found out that the body had been cremated.
Ivonne Matheson's body had been autopsied 3 days after her death. On the island of Hawaii, the coroner is also the chief of police. A pathologist from a nearby hospital is retained as a consultant. The pathologist was told that the death was accidental. But a pathologist specializes in natural causes of death, such as disease. Even so, he could tell that the victim's injuries didn't jibe with Ken Matheson's account. The pathologist noted injuries to the victim's head, arms, and hands that weren't consistent with being run over or tumbling out of the vehicle. But the interpretation of these injuries lay outside the scope of the consulting pathologist's training. It was really a job for a forensic pathologist who specializes in death by unnatural causes. Still, puzzled by his findings, the pathologist was sure to photograph every aspect of the victim and to take tissue samples. Now that the victim had been cremated, they were all that was left. A tragic accident case was now turning ugly. Spohn knew there was enough cause to open a homicide investigation, But without a body, there might not be enough evidence to resolve it. The original pathologist's photos and the evidence from the van would have to be enough. He braced himself for the inevitable public outcry.
In some ways, it's kind of a no-win situation. If you investigate and find out that the police officer is innocent and you announce that, everybody says, well, it's swept under the rug because this is a police officer. And if you investigate the case and you find out that the officer is guilty and you charge him, everybody says you're only charging him because you're buckling under to public pressure and he's actually innocent.
Sure enough, 6 months into the investigation, widespread criticism forced Sergeant Ken Matheson's superiors to put him on desk duty while he remained a suspect. The press coverage brought to light an intriguing incident. A witness who read about the case in the papers told investigators that on the night of the accident, he stopped to help shortly after 9 p.m. As he pulled over, a man, possibly Ken Matheson, stepped from the back of the van and shined a flashlight in his eyes. He told the Samaritan that no one was injured and that the police had already been called. Then he sent him away. Investigators now suspected that perhaps the passerby interrupted the crime in progress. They just had to prove it.
So here's the town of Mount Martin. One of the interesting things about...
In Hawaii, Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn faced the unhappy task of investigating Sergeant Ken Matheson for murder. To find out more about the blood spatter in the driver's area of Matheson's van, he asked a colleague to locate the best blood spatter expert in the country.
Approximately a 28-mile drive. A couple of days later, he told me that it was someone by the name of Dr. Henry Lee, who was the head of the Connecticut State Forensics Laboratory.
Henry Lee, who is now Commissioner of the state's Department of Public Safety, uses the laws of physics to uphold the laws of justice. His expertise is reading clues written in blood.
That's called medium velocity.
He's not afraid to get his hands dirty in the process. Like any substance, blood is affected by gravity and momentum. Every kind of bloodshed leaves behind characteristic clues. Stabbing will create a dripping pattern. The relatively low velocity of the weapon doesn't propel blood too far from the source. A speeding bullet, on the other hand, creates a bloody mist. And a bludgeoning wound produces large spatters that can spray far. By examining the tiny tails behind each drop of blood, Lee can determine the position of the victim and the amount of force used to create the injury. From this, and from the size of the wound, he can determine the type of weapon used and deduce the circumstances of a person's death. Lee is perhaps most famous for his work on the O.J. Simpson trial. He's also helped identify victims in mass graves in Bosnia.
She was in fact.
As soon as Lee received the photos taken from the Matheson case, he pored over them and became suspicious. He felt he was definitely looking at a crime scene.
After I received the photograph, did the detailed examination, my initial reaction, something is wrong with this case. Some foul play took place inside the van.
From the photographs of the driver's side window, Lee could tell that the blood at the front of the van was spattered at medium velocity, suggesting blunt force trauma. It appeared the victim was struck multiple times. The bloodstains on the window also contradicted Matheson's assertion that his wife dived out of it.
At the time of incident, this window was up. Approximately 200 medium velocity blood spatter was noticed in this area alone.
Lee needed to see the van firsthand to trace the trajectory of the spatter. Strings were connected to each droplet to determine their common point of origin. It turned out to be the driver's seat area, about the height where a person's head would be. Lee's findings showed the damage was inflicted before she left the vehicle. The photos from the autopsy showed that the victim's head had sustained enough damage to kill her. Once Dr. Lee determined that a struggle had occurred in the van, investigators knew that Ken Matheson was lying. His motive for killing his wife was probably money.
If she died in an accident, he would be paid $595,000, and if she died in an automobile-related accident, he would be paid $675,000.
Sir, step out of the car. Put your hands up. Keep your hands where I can see them. Face down on the ground. Come on, over here in the grass. Face down. Move it. Face down.
Based on the evidence, Ken Matheson was arrested on his day off. Police pieced together the murder. While Ivonne was driving, Ken Matheson struck her with a blunt object. She probably stopped the vehicle, or he gained control and brought it to a stop. He continued beating her to the brink of death. Marks on her hands suggested she had tried to defend herself. In the dark, Matheson probably didn't realize he was leaving the blood spatters that would be his undoing. Once he was sure that his wife wouldn't survive, he carried her out of the van and ran over her. He carried her back into the van and waited for someone to stop and call for help.
We had, a gut feeling and a lot of suspicions. We didn't have any hard evidence. So Dr. Lee's blood spatter analysis is what gave us our first piece of really hard evidence.
In 1995, Ken Matheson was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and murder. He's not eligible for parole for 25 years. Sometimes a coroner's findings can only tell part of the story. When that happens, forensic criminalists like Dr. Lee give a voice to the victims who would otherwise be silenced forever.
Victim died. She cannot testify. Physical evidence speak for her.
Matheson's simple but gruesome crime was undone by some forensic details that he just didn't count on. But can the same forensic science that proves murder also be used to prove that no murder was committed? Experts in New York State hoped it could. The town of Munnsville in central New York is one of those quiet, picturesque places that blends unnoticed into the landscape as motorists rush past. In June 1990, it became an unlikely battleground for a most unlikely soldier. The trouble started in a shabby farmhouse outside of town. Delbert Ward, 59, awoke at dawn to milk his cows. He'd tried earlier to awaken his brother, William, but he didn't move. William hadn't been feeling well lately. Delbert thought it best to let him sleep. Delbert would take care of the chores without him today. The four Ward brothers were quiet and simple-minded. They'd spent their entire lives on the dairy farm. It was their universe, all they had and all they knew. Reclusive and childlike, the brothers even shared their bed, probably as they had done since boyhood. William, the oldest, was also the smartest and strongest. He ran the show. Delbert was his right-hand man. The other brothers, Roscoe and Lyman, occasionally pitched in to help out. But on this day, June 6th, Delbert was on his own. Even after he finished his chores, he couldn't wake brother William. Something was wrong.
Roscoe! Roscoe, come here, come here. I need your help. Look, he ain't getting up, man. He's sick. He ain't getting up.
Delbert called his brothers. The men didn't know what to do. Because the Ward brothers had no phone, Delbert and Roscoe walked to a neighbor's house to call for help. Their fourth brother, Lyman, watched after William until it arrived. 20 minutes after Delbert placed the call, state troopers and the Madison County coroner appeared at the farm. William's body was examined. No signs of foul play were noted. It seemed that 64-year-old William died peacefully in his sleep. His body was transported to the medical examiner's office, while police interviewed the surviving brothers. In the following days, the brothers tried to get on with their work. It would be difficult without Brother Bill.
Won't give you too much at once. Spill it on yourself.
Delbert's life would be much harder, and his troubles were just beginning. At William's autopsy, the assistant medical examiner took tissue samples and careful notes. No indicators of natural disease were noted in the report. However, something unusual demanded attention. Pinpoint-size hemorrhages in William's eyes, mouth, and windpipe. These tiny spots, called petechial hemorrhages, can have a number of causes. Often, it's the first tip-off to death by suffocation. The assistant medical examiner couldn't rule out death by unnatural means. On the death certificate, cause of death was listed as pending further study. The district attorney was contacted and told the case was bothersome. And here's where communication apparently began to break down. The message was passed along to the state police, and the suspicions about the petechial hemorrhages became garbled along the way. Now, the possibility of homicide became a certainty. Delbert was taken to the station for questioning. He was interviewed for 4 hours.
Isn't it true that you had something to do with him being sick?
His interrogation was not recorded.
I am answering his questions.
According to attorney Ralph Cognetti in Albany, New York, Delbert was confused by all the attention. He only wanted to return to the farm, so he was soon willing to say anything. He signed the confession.
Tell them what they want to hear and they'll let you go home, and that's in fact what they said to him. They certainly didn't let him go home after he confessed. But if you have an opportunity to read the confession, it really sounds like a Harvard dissertation, and you know, certainly inside, that that did not come from Delbert's lips.
Nevertheless, the confession, coupled with the autopsy results, were enough to arrest Delbert. Later, a grand jury handed up an indictment against him for second-degree murder. To the people of Munnsville, population 400, it was absurd to think that Delbert would or could have killed his brother. They believed the state had it all wrong. When his bail was set at $10,000, the whole town chipped in and raised the money in a matter of hours. The kindness of the neighbors and the plight of Delbert Ward earned an article in the New York Times. The groundswell of support for Delbert began to grow. A friend of the Wards brought Ralph Cognetti into the case. Based on his conversation with Delbert, Cognetti was convinced of his client's innocence. A review of the evidence suggested that the homicide charge was based more on Delbert's confession than on the physical evidence from the medical examiner's office. As Cognetti was putting his defense together, he received a fateful call. The man identified himself as Cyril Wecht. The name meant nothing to Cognetti.
Here was a gentleman who explained that he was a forensic pathologist from Pittsburgh, and that he had read the article, read the story about the boys, and was willing to review whatever evidence we had without any cost to us.
In other words, what you're telling me is...
Dr. Cyril Wecht's reputation spreads far beyond the walls of the coroner's office in Pittsburgh, where he works as the chief forensic pathologist for Allegheny County. He's helped investigators on the assassination of Robert Kennedy and has consulted in the death of Elvis Presley. Besides degrees in medicine, Wecht also holds a degree in law. He'd read about the Delbert Ward case in the New York Times, and it piqued his interest. He requested William Ward's case file.
After I reviewed the case file, which included the autopsy report, my initial impression was that there was an inadequate basis for any forensic pathologist to conclude that this was an asphyxiation death from suffocation, smothering. There simply were not adequate findings for such a diagnosis.
Using the assistant medical examiner's original notes, Wecht formulated a more mundane diagnosis. William Ward died of heart disease, the #1 killer of men his age in America. The Ward brothers had in fact told authorities that William had been in poor health for years, but he refused to see a physician. His symptoms were consistent with cardiovascular disease, supporting Wecht's theory. But the prosecution believed that William's illness may have provided a motive for his murder. Did Delbert Ward kill his brother William? The state of New York said he did. According to their theory, Delbert suffocated his brother to release him from his failing health. They said that it may have been a mercy killing, but it was murder nonetheless. The prosecution pointed to Delbert's odd behavior on the day of William's death. When Delbert couldn't rouse his brother at the crack of dawn like he normally did, he went about his chores anyhow. To the prosecution, that lack of concern suggested guilt. To Ralph Cognetti, it said more about the realities of life on a farm.
It was a point that the prosecutor jumped on. How could a person who was so concerned about his brother's well-being go and milk cows? What came out at trial, and what I'm sure the jurors knew because we had 1 or 2 dairy farmers on the jury, was that if you don't milk a cow when it needs to be milked, then that cow's going to get very ill.
Cognetti and Cyril Wecht stuck with the idea that William died of natural causes, but they had to prove it. The victim had already been buried. All Wecht had to work from were the autopsy records, those same records and tissue samples that the state claimed showed nothing unusual besides the petechial hemorrhages. That's not how Wecht read them. He was confident that he had everything he needed to prove Ward's innocence. According to the thin tissue samples gathered at William Ward's autopsy, along with the medical examiner's data, William's heart was enlarged and his coronary arteries suffered a blockage of 20%. His right lung was heavily scarred and weighed twice as much as his left. His liver and spleen also were enlarged. Without a drastic change in habits, death by heart disease seemed inevitable for William. But Wecht had to undermine the prosecution's assertion that he was murdered to be relieved of his suffering. Though Wecht had only photographs and tissue samples of William Ward to work from, he called upon his vast experience on other cases where he had examined the bodies directly. He noted the petechiae, the telltale red hemorrhages found in the victim's eyes and mouth. To the state, these were clear signs of strangling. They eclipsed all other symptoms. While it's true that petechial hemorrhages can indicate smothering, they're not enough to prove it beyond a doubt. Unless a person is somehow incapacitated before he's smothered, the body will likely show signs of a struggle. William Ward's did not.
No injuries around the mouth, in the mouth, and the tongue, the gums. No injuries on or around the neck. No evidence of increased fluidity of the blood. No evidence of increased blueness of the blood. No aspiration of gastric contents that will occur as a person struggles. So we had none of it.
For the defense, there was no evidence of murder. William simply died in his sleep of heart disease. The homicide charge was the result of an unfortunate series of miscommunications that had grown out of control.
Or you can take the incident seen by one person and then passed on to a second and to a third. And then when you get down to the 6th or the 10th or the 15th, you'll find that that story bears very little relationship to the original creation, to the original version.
Coming into the case as an outsider, Wecht was immune to the preconceptions that Delbert Ward was a murderer. By looking at the case with a fresh perspective, he won Delbert's freedom. On April 5th, 1991, Delbert Ward was acquitted of all charges.
It grew like a bomb almost. It started small, and then by the end of the trial, he became what he is today, really a legend, certainly in that part of the state.
Cyril Wecht believes that the situation that Delbert Ward found himself in was not unusual. He's seen many cases that were tainted by a medical examiner's wrong assumptions, an investigator's speedy conclusion, or a simple misunderstanding. Unfortunately, these errors tend to compound themselves.
We work closely and constantly with homicide detectives, with police, with district attorneys. We hear their versions. Consciously, subconsciously, those versions begin to take hold. And the mind then begins to work. And you build up then your own impressions, ultimately your own opinions and conclusions that fit in best with those.
No matter how mysterious or suspicious a death may appear, the truth can be resurrected in the lab. Every day, the forensic skills of the medical examiner, coroner, and crime scene expert prove that the most important witness to a death is the deceased.